Since it's 40 years since the time when the story is set, and also on the occasion of my own 40th birthday, I've recently reread George Orwell's 1984, which has set me off on a bit of an Orwell binge, and I've been down the Orwell rabbit hole a little bit. I wanted to share some of my thoughts. I vaguely remember reading both 1984 and Animal Farm in my teens, but I haven't picked either of them up since then. And uh, the feeling that the real content of both of these books has given way a little bit to their myths in popular culture. Um, I have reconnected with Orwell a couple of times in the last 10 or 20 years, but it's been with his non-fiction work. So these are some initial observations, some things that struck me on returning to Orwell's final novel as an adult. The first thing I thought of is that it's longer than I remembered. It's definitely not a pamphlet. It's not a novella. 1984 is a much more substantial novel than Animal Farm. I think I'd possibly conflated them a little bit in my head. I'd lumped them together since they are probably Orwell's most famous works. They're his last two novels, and they're the two that are political allegories. Although I've come to see that 1984 is more than that. It has a bit more to offer. Um, Also, 1984 is pretty digestible. It's pretty readable. I enjoyed it a little bit more than I expected to, albeit there are some passages that feel a bit drawn out, that feel a bit stretched. There are also some others where you might want to read a little and then stop to mull it over, to think about it, to digest it. I'm not a very fast reader, but I got through it pretty quickly. I found it to be much more of a page turner than I'd expected. Another thing that struck me, and this might seem a slightly strange thing to say, or maybe it seems to be saying it the wrong way around, were the similarities to Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, simply because I'd read it more recently. It was fresher in my mind. Um, but really, I found life in Oceania and in Atwood's Gilead to be really quite similar. Now, of course, that's no surprise. Atwood openly borrowed a lot, was inspired by Orwell. She's spoken and written a lot about how 1984 influenced her. I think maybe what struck me though was just how many aspects of life in Oceania and in Gilead seem to find parallels one with the other. So, for example, the 2 minutes hate in Orwell's 1984. And the similarity with the group executions or the salvagings, these ceremonial outpourings of zeal and fervour for the party, for the doctrine, for the cause that appear in both books. There are also scenes with the protagonists alone in Spartan rooms with cubby holes and hiding places. There are also the furtive glances looking for possible allies and trying to suss everyone out. Really, the two novels do have quite a similar feel. And I think what it's made clear to me is just how much Orwell's book has become a template for dystopian fiction. It's a case of theme and variation, and now I'm motivated to hunt down more examples of this genre or subgenre and compare them. And I want to start with Zamyatin's We, which supposedly influenced Orwell in much the same way as he would go on to influence Atwood and many others. Um, Another thing that surprised me a little, or that struck me a little about 1984, is just how good Orwell's prose is. I think that in my head, Orwell was first and foremost a journalist, but who also dabbled in writing some fiction in a very plain style and whose principal motivation was political and didactic. I think this notion probably came about for me because in my life, in my adult life, I'd only really read his non-fiction work, Homage to Catalonia, Down and Out in Paris and London, some of his better known essays, The Lion and the Unicorn on politics and the English language. And I hadn't read any of Orwell's fiction since my early teens, and I think this had distorted my expectations a little. Um, in reality, Orwell had a very developed prose style. The narrative of 1984 is plain and straight talking, but that's carefully chosen and carefully crafted. It's not because he was a journalist having a go at writing a novel. That seems like quite a naive thing to have thought. Um, If you compare, for example, 1984 with his much earlier Burmese Days, which I've read since, the narrative voices are really quite different. Each is crafted to match the subject matter and the environment that he's trying to portray. Having said that, the narrative in 1984 can be blatantly expository at some points. What I mean by that is that Orwell's world building sometimes is done by telling you how things are and not showing. You get these passages of narrative that are very focalized on the protagonist, Winston. Essentially, you're very close to his inner monologue. Um, and yet he's outlining bits of the history of Oceania and of Airstrip 1 that he has no particular reason to be thinking about other than to be telling us so that we can know it. And that kind of narrative can be it can be a little bit on the nose for my tastes. It can feel like the author is just arbitrarily telling you stuff rather than showing it in a more subtle way. But I think it's not unforgivable. It's not too distracting. It cheats a little bit with the limited point of view of the narrator. But if you're very sensitive to that, it might bother you. But it's not unforgivable. It's not too bad. Um, Another thing that struck me um, was just how much we can find in 1984 elements of different authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. Now, of course, 1984 was written primarily as a denouncement of Stalinism. We know that Orwell was mostly thinking about Stalin's Soviet Union. That's the whole deal. I'm not denying that. I'm not suggesting anything else. So before I add any supplementary interpretations or start going into any of my own ideas, I should be clear that that's what Orwell was writing for. It was a denouncement of Stalinism and a warning specifically to those in the West who thought that Stalin was a great guy and was doing a great thing. But there are details in the workings of Airstrip 1. So this is the British Isles, or at least the island of Great Britain as it has become, that bring to mind, when seen from our time, later authoritarian regimes such as the GDR, North Korea, China, etc. But there's also, but perhaps more interesting than that, um, of all the oppressive systems that the world has seen, I think Orwell drew at least some of his inspiration from the British Empire. After all, in none of the other regimes that I've just mentioned have we seen 85% of the populace, so the proles, the proletariat, being able to lead relatively free lives as they do in Oceania in 1984. Albeit they are constrained to conditions of squalor and ignorance, any hint of rebellion is swiftly and violently quashed. And that certainly was the case. This ability of freedom to live your impoverished, squalid, ignorant life, as long as you don't overstep the boundaries. That certainly was the case in some of the territories of the British Empire, where Orwell was born. He was born in India, and he served in the empire in Burma as an adult, which he wrote about in Burmese Days. So in India, for example, the empire was concerned with administrating, managing, with resource extraction, with the work of what would be the party. But it didn't micromanage the lives of the natives, which would be the proles in 1984, unless they showed themselves to be dissidents or rabble rousers. To push the boat out even further, we might also consider Orwell's time at boarding school as a young boy, which he wrote about in the essay Such Were the Joys. Read it and let me know if you think there's anything in there that might have helped to share Orwell's or to shape Orwell's depiction of life in the London of 1984, of life in the party, of the claustrophobic corridors of the ministry. Read the way that he talks about his old prep school mistress, and be prepared to change the way you understand Winston's relationship with O'Brien in 1984. You might disagree, but personally, I find that the pages of 1984 are dripping with Orwell's own personal experiences of tyranny. Another striking feature of 1984 is the prescience of the telescreens. So, the telescreens in 1984 have entered the popular imagination as these harbingers of the invasion of privacy constituted by the television, which is omnipresent or has become omnipresent in our lives, with its sensationalized news reports and the ceaseless stream of advertising and propaganda. It might be worth noting that the adoption of television was already exploding in the years that Orwell was working on 1984, at least in the United States. In the UK, less so, since there'd been no television broadcast during the Second World War. BBC television as a concept and as a project had only just resumed in 1946. I think Orwell started writing this book in 47. It would take many more years, of course, to build out a national television network. So even at the time of Orwell's death, society was still very far from there being a screen in every home, as there is in the book. Um, but it wouldn't really be until the widespread use of such devices as the webcam and the camera phone in the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, that the screen would have the ability to look back at us as the telescreens do in 1984. When Winston's doing his exercises in front of the screen and he gets told off by the instructor, a reader in the 2020s is surely immediately going to be reminded of COVID lockdowns and online lessons and all of that. What is kind of curious is that, as prescient as it was, the telescreen is really the only technological innovation that Orwell imagined in the whole novel, with the possible exception of some of the things that we find in the rooms of the Ministry of Love towards the end of the book. Forgot to move my slides on. Another thing that I found in 1984 that surprised me a little bit were allusions to Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War. Specifically, I'm referring to the uh, factional fighting and the internal party coups. Um, it, they're only spoken about very briefly in 1984, around the time of the revolution that supposedly happened in the 1960s. Um, there's not a huge amount of detail. The memories of the time are deliberately clouded. Um, but the intrigue and the infighting that Orwell describes in in the origins of Oceania and Airstrip One and the world of 1984, um, really is quite similar to the kind of factional infighting and the power struggles that Orwell saw himself when fighting in Spain, as he recounted in Homage to Catalonia. Um, I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that a part of Orwell's inspiration for 1984 could lie in an imagining, a conjecture about what might have happened had a Stalinist government resulted from the Spanish Civil War, i.e., if the Republican side had won and the Stalinist communist bloc had managed to seize power. So Orwell fought with a different communist faction. He fought with the Trotskyists who were trying to oust the Stalinists. That's a whole other story. It'd be interesting. If you're interested in this story, you can read Orwell's own account of it, or read a little of the history of it. But I think that when you combine the two things, 1984 and Orwell's experiences in Spain, it's hard to imagine that he didn't take at least some inspiration from it. Um, so I don't know if other people see that in there. I don't know if that's something that's been talked about a lot. It's not maybe not the first thing that people think of when they talk about 1984, but I think there's an influence in there. Another thing that struck me about 1984 on rereading it is just how much sex there is in it, or rather, how sexually charged it is, and the importance that sexuality has in the development of the characters and the development of their world. Um, I think that I remembered from having read it before that there was some intercourse in the story, that there were sex scenes in it, but I'd forgotten or blocked out or maybe never quite grasped just how much it dominated Winston's thoughts and shaped his life. So the novel treats both Winston's and Julia's sexuality with a mostly unromantic kind of realism that makes the book feel somewhat ahead of its time in a strange way, and perhaps helps to connect their world to ours. We learn so much about Winston through the part where he's forcing himself to remember an encounter with a prostitute and to record it in his diary. His diary entries are interspersed with the narrative, with the third person narrative, um, of us watching him write and hearing him think back to what happened. Um, the details of the encounter are completely grotesque, but the whole passage is quite profound, and it's quite a realistic treatment of the act of performing memory, of forcing himself to remember and to feel and to record, which is really important to Winston and to our sense of hope for the future of these characters and of this place. The whole scene fits really nicely into the book. It reveals a lot of Winston's humanity and his life story, and it's used as a slightly cleverer device to reveal more about everyday life in Airstrip 1. Likewise, I was struck by how much violence there is in the book. And I'm not talking about the torture of the captured dissidents, but I'm talking more about Winston's inner violence and his desire to harm others, including Julia. When he thinks that she's a member of the thought police, at one point he literally considers killing her quite brutally, so as not to have his thought crime found out. And he fantasizes at one point about raping her. It's really stark, bleak writing, and Orwell clearly draws on some pretty dark resources in producing it. But it's bold, and it's part of what makes Winston feel like a realistic and three-dimensional character. We have to suppose that having grown up under Big Brother, you would develop a dark personality. You would definitely have a dark side to your character. It's quite crazy, but there's an honesty to it. Uh, to know that Winston has these thoughts soils him as a character. It's an affront to whatever perception we might have been building of him as a hero. When you read about what he thinks about doing to Julia, it's a challenge to our empathy for him. It makes you stop and think, Jesus, Winston, I thought you were the good guy here. So we have to remember that Winston, like everyone else around him, has suffered under a totalitarian regime for most of his life. He suffered the trauma of being separated from his family at a young age. Freud would have a field day with Winston's mummy issues. Uh, Given the circumstances, did you expect him to be a good guy? I'm not sure that we're supposed to like Winston very much at all. We're just supposed to believe him. We could also talk about Julia's trauma and her behaviour. I think we should have pretty low expectations for the quality of character of the people who've grown up under this regime, who've grown up in the party. They're going to be, for the most part, pretty broken people. And I think Orwell uses these violent thoughts that Winston has to draw that out. Finally, I was impressed by how much of Orwell himself seems to appear in Winston. Now, this could be my own speculation. Some of it might be a bit of a reach to beyond the text. But apart from the obvious political alignment and the railing at totalitarianism, Winston's own life seems to contain a lot of the author. I think it's natural and kind of obvious for an author to put a lot of themselves into their protagonists. But for example, on one occasion when Winston ventures out into the world of the proles, we get to witness him in action as a kind of bumbling and impatient journalist. He's trying to get answers from some of the older people who live in the city, the proles, about what they remember of the past and the time before the revolution. And it ends in absolute frustration for him as he's unable to do that. And to me, I think there's something of Orwell, the journalist, in Winston's behaviour in those scenes. Of course, there's the diary writing as well, right? Winston is a kind of struggling and frustrated diarist who forces himself to get his ideas down on the page. There's something in there about the writer's struggle. Also, in terms of Winston's relationships with other characters, uh, he loves O'Brien, his torturer, because he's principled and strong. Just as Orwell was able to appreciate and to feel some affinity to uh, strong, principled people, even though he disagreed with their policies. For example, Orwell didn't necessarily agree with the politics of Churchill. Interesting, Winston. Um, but Orwell did respect him. He respected Churchill as a politician, even though he disliked his policies. Um, Similarly, Orwell made an edit to Animal Farm because he didn't want to represent Stalin unfairly or make him look like a coward. He realized that he'd got the facts wrong. And even though this is Joseph Stalin, his lifelong arch enemy, the object of his ire and all of his political writing, he thought it important to give him a fair hearing, not to imply that he had done something cowardly that he hadn't done. Um, what Winston dislikes most of all are the cranks and the phonies, the party lackeys like Parsons. But he respects the ones uh, who are strong and principled. I feel like I could go on about Winston's relationships with Julia and with O'Brien, how there's really no love between him and his lover, and the irony of the true love, or at least the affinity that he feels with his tormentor. But I think I'll leave that for maybe another day. So, in conclusion, uh, everyone knows that 1984 is about Stalinism and the Soviet Union, and kind of imagining that that happened in England, etc. For the interested reader, that's a given in 1984. But I think it's important to note that it's not necessarily as straightforward an allegory as Animal Farm is, for example. I've found it interesting to think about what other influences might have found their way into the pages of 1984, from the author's school days to his time serving in the Empire to his experiences in the Spanish Civil War. It's all of the extra stuff, the biographical stuff, the way that he seems to have folded in all kinds of influences from different periods of his life. Also, the fact that this was a final novel of a man who knew that he wasn't long for this world, that shaped 1984 in my mind as Orwell's magnum opus. As in this, it's the sum of his life's work. It includes a lot of the ideas that he's developed over a lifetime. Obviously, it's a supremely influential work and a reference in 20th century literature. Coming back to it as a grown up, I've definitely got 1,000 times more from it than I did reading it as a teenager. Who knows if there's really even any point in reading such a book at the age of 14 or whatever I was. Um, I really don't know. I think I've got much more out of it as a more politically aware adult. And now I'm embarking down two different Orwellian rabbit holes, one of Orwell's own writing, his essays and his earlier novels, and another which is the canon of dystopian literature that surrounds him. And I'm looking forward to discovering some of it. So thanks very much for letting me share my ideas. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. And yeah, see you in the next one.